Blind girl begs a millionaire for help. When she discovers the reason, he's furious and takes an action that shocks everyone. Subscribe to the channel to support my work and comment what was the greatest joy you've ever experienced in your life. Little Emily sat on the cold sidewalk, leaning against the rough brick wall of an office building. Her trembling fingers clutched a stale piece of bread she had found earlier. The world around her was a blurry mess of colors and shadows. With only 25% vision in one eye, she could barely make out the faces of the people hurrying by, ignoring her presence. It had been 3 months since her mom disappeared. Emily still remembered the last time she saw her, her face worried as she said she needed to take care of something important and would be right back. "Wait here, honey. Mommy will be back soon." But she never returned. The first few days were the worst. Emily waited in the same spot, sleeping curled up in the doorway of a closed store, certain her mum would come back any minute. When the hunger became unbearable, she started wandering the streets, looking for scraps of food. Her limited vision made every step a challenge. She often tripped or bumped into people, receiving glares of annoyance or at best pity. On that particularly cold morning, Emily watched the activity on the avenue with her blurred vision. The noise of the cars and the distant voices mingled into a confusing jumble of sounds she had long since learned to decipher. She knew it was lunchtime, the time when well-dressed executives came out of the nearby office buildings looking for restaurants. It was her best chance to get a few coins. She got up with difficulty, her thin legs trembling under the weight of her malnourished body. Her dress, once pink and now an indeterminate color from the dirt, was torn at the edges. Her dark hair, which her mom used to brush so carefully every morning, was tangled and dull. That's when she saw him, or rather sensed his imposing presence. A tall man wearing a burgundy suit that stood out even through her impaired vision. His shoes shone so brightly that Emily could distinguish the reflection of the light on them. He was standing near the entrance of a fancy restaurant, apparently waiting for someone. Emily took a deep breath, gathering her courage. Rich people sometimes felt more sympathetic when they saw a child trying to work than simply begging. She found a scrap of cloth on the ground and, limping slightly, approached the man. "Sir, can I shine your shoes? Just $1." Her voice came out trembling, almost a whisper. The man looked down, his face contorting in a look of disgust. "Get out of here, you little urchin." But Emily was too desperate to back down. She knelt and began to rub the cloth on his gleaming shoe. That's when she felt a sharp pain. The man had kicked her shoulder hard, throwing her to the ground. The physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation. Tears began to stream down her dirty face as people passed by, some slowing down to watch the scene, but no one intervening. Emily tried to get up, but her legs trembled too much. Across the street, inside a parked black Porsche, Mr. Harrison, known in business circles for his discretion and considerable wealth, watched the scene with clenched fists. He rarely got involved in public situations, but there was something about that scene that made him feel a rage he hadn't experienced in years. Without a second thought, he opened the car door and strode across the street. The sound of his Italian shoes against the asphalt drew the attention of the curious onlookers. Emily, still on the ground, could only see a tall figure approaching, and cowered, expecting another blow. "What kind of man assaults a child?" Mr. Harrison's voice sounded low and controlled, but filled with a contained fury that made the aggressor step back. She was dirtying my shoe," the man stammered, but then his eyes widened in recognition. "Wait, you're Mr. Harrison?" Mr. Harrison ignored the question and knelt beside Emily, who was still trembling. For the first time in a long time, someone looked at her, not with contempt or pity, but with genuine concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked softly, noticing how she tried to focus her gaze on him without success. Emily shook her head negatively, but a wince of pain contradicted her gesture. Mr. Harrison realized there was something wrong with her eyes. She seemed to have trouble focusing on him, even though he was so close. "What's your name?" "Emily," she answered in a faint voice. "Where's your mom, Emily?" The question brought fresh tears to her eyes. She's gone. It's been a long time." Mr. Harrison felt a pang in his chest, a feeling he couldn't explain. Without hesitating, he extended his hand to her. "Come with me. We're going to take care of you." Emily hesitated for a moment. Years of surviving on the streets had taught her to distrust the kindness of strangers. But there was something different about this man, something in his voice that made her accept his outstretched hand. When Mr. Harrison helped her up, he realized how light she was, dangerously light for a child her age. He led her to his car, ignoring the stares and murmurs of the people around them. The aggressor was still standing in the same place, his face a mask of fear and shame. Mr. Harrison paused for a moment and glared at him. "If I hear that you've touched another child, it won't just be your reputation that's at risk." Inside the luxurious car, Emily huddled on the leather seat, afraid of getting it dirty. The smell of newness and cleanliness was so different from the smells of the streets she was used to. Through her blurred vision, she watched Mr. Harrison start the car, still not believing that this was really happening. "Where are we going?" she asked timidly. "First, we're going to take you to a doctor. We need to figure out what's wrong with your eyes." Emily hugged her knees, a question burning in her throat. Finally, she mustered the courage to ask it. And then Mr. Harrison looked at her through the rearview mirror, noticing how she desperately tried to focus on him. "After that, we're going to find your mom." The car glided smoothly through the city traffic, taking Emily away from the streets that had been her home for the past few months. What she didn't know was that this journey would change her life forever, and not just hers. The doctor's office was a completely foreign environment for Emily. The smell of cleaning products and medicines made her nose itch as she tried to balance herself on the large leather chair in the examination room. Her feet, covered in worn and dirty shoes, didn't even touch the floor. Mr. Harrison remained by her side, his imposing presence somehow conveying a sense of security she hadn't felt in months. Dr. Ramirez, a renowned ophthalmologist, performed a series of detailed examinations on Emily's eyes. The girl tried to remain still, but every time the doctor approached with some device, her whole body tensed with fear. Years of living on the streets had left deep marks on her behavior. "Relax, sweetie," the doctor whispered gently. "It won't hurt at all." Emily nodded slightly, but her hands continued to grip the edge of the chair tightly. Through her blurred vision, she tried to distinguish the expressions on the doctor's face as she performed the tests. The silence in the office was heavy, broken only by the soft sound of the equipment. After what seemed like an eternity, Dr. Ramirez stepped back and sat down behind her desk. Her face was serious as she organized some notes. Emily could feel the tension building in the room. "Mr. Harrison, may I speak with you in private?" the doctor asked, giving Emily a meaningful look. Mr. Harrison hesitated for a moment, looking at the girl who seemed even smaller and more fragile under the fluorescent lights of the office. "Emily, can you wait here for a minute? I promise I'll be right back." The girl felt her heart race. The last similar words she had heard had been from her mother before she disappeared. Her eyes filled with tears as she shook her head negatively. "Please don't leave me alone," she whispered, her voice choked with fear. Mr. Harrison felt a pang in his chest. He knelt beside her chair, getting down to her eye level. "Emily, look at me. I promise I'll come back. I'm just going next door, and you can see me through the glass in the door. Okay?" Emily studied his face for a moment, trying to focus on it with her impaired vision. There was something in his voice, a sincerity she wasn't used to hearing from adults. Slowly, she nodded. In the adjacent room, Dr. Ramirez waited with a grave expression. As soon as Mr. Harrison closed the door, she began to speak in a low voice. "Mr. Harrison, the situation is more serious than we thought. Emily has a degenerative condition in her eyes, aggravated by the lack of proper treatment and severe malnutrition. If we don't act quickly, she could completely lose her vision within a matter of months." Mr. Harrison felt the weight of those words. "Is there treatment?" "Yes, but it's a complex and extremely expensive procedure. It will require multiple surgeries, in addition to a long period of recovery and follow-up. And even then, I can't guarantee 100% success." "Money is no object," Mr. Harrison replied immediately. "What do we need to do?" The doctor hesitated for a moment. Mr. Harrison, before we proceed, I need to warn you about something. Emily is severely malnourished. The ophthalmological treatment can only begin after she's stronger. Also," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "legally, we need to notify Child Protective Services about a minor in a state of neglect." Mr. Harrison ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of the situation. Through the glass in the door, he could see Emily sitting in the same position, her small hand still gripping the chair, her eyes fixed on the door, waiting for his return. "Doctor, that little girl has suffered enough. If we notify CPS now, she'll be taken to a foster home, and she might lose the chance to regain her sight. Let me help her first. I promise we'll do everything by the book, but we need to act fast." The doctor observed the businessman for a moment. She knew Mr. Harrison by name and reputation, a successful businessman known for his discretion and seriousness. She never imagined him involved in a situation like this. "All right," she finally agreed. "I'll prepare a detailed report of the case and an initial prescription. She'll need vitamins, a special diet, and plenty of rest before we can start the ophthalmological treatment." When they returned to the examination room, they found Emily exactly as they had left her, but her cheeks were wet with silent tears. Upon seeing Mr. Harrison, her face lit up with a small smile of relief. "You came back," she whispered, as if she didn't really believe it. "I promised, didn't I?" he replied, sitting down beside her. "Emily, Dr. Ramirez is going to help us take care of your eyes, but first we need to take care of you. You're very weak and need to get strong for the treatment, okay?" Emily nodded, but then her expression changed, as if she remembered something important. "But now, what about my mom? She might be looking for me. What if she comes back and doesn't find me?" Mr. Harrison felt his heart clench. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that her mother probably won't return to the place where she left her after so long? But he couldn't take away her hope of finding her mother either. "Emily, I promise we'll look for your mum. I have friends who can help us find her. But in the meantime, you need to get well, get strong. Your mum would want that, wouldn't she?" The girl was silent for a moment, processing those words. Finally, she asked in a low voice, "Where am I going to stay?" "For now, you're going to stay at my house. I have a guest room that can be yours, and a very nice housekeeper named Susan who'll help take care of you. What do you think?" Emily bit her lip, unsure. "But I'm very dirty. I'll get your house dirty." Mr. Harrison felt his eyes sting with suppressed tears. A 6-year-old shouldn't be worrying about things like that. "Don't worry about that. We're going to stop by some stores first, buy you some new clothes, and then you can take a nice warm bath. How does that sound?" The idea of a warm bath made Emily's eyes light up. She hadn't had a real bath since her mother disappeared. As they left the office, Dr. Ramirez watched the interaction between the two with interest. It was evident that something special was being born there, a connection that went beyond simple charity. On the way to the mall, Emily remained quiet in the back seat of the car. her small body tense, as if she expected to wake up at any moment and discover that it was all just a dream. Mr. Harrison watched her through the rearview mirror, his heart heavy as he thought about everything that child had already been through. Arriving at the mall, Emily gaped at the lights and the activity. Even with her limited vision, she had never seen anything like it. Mr. Harrison gently led her through several stores, choosing clothes, shoes, and everything else she might need. In one of the stores, while trying on a new dress, Emily overheard two saleswomen whispering, "Could she be his daughter?" "Impossible. Everyone knows Mr. Harrison doesn't have a family." "Then it must be another marketing stunt. Rich people love to do charity when there's a camera around." Emily felt her face burn with shame. Could that be it? Was he only being nice to get in the news? Her small heart clenched with doubt. But then Mr. Harrison appeared with some more clothes in his arms, and the look on his face when he saw her in the new dress was too genuine to be faked. His eyes sparkled in a way that Emily, even with her impaired vision, could perceive. "You look beautiful, sweetie," he said sincerely. "Do you want to take this one too?" Emily nodded timidly, but something still bothered her. When they were returning to the car, loaded with shopping bags, she finally mustered the courage to ask, "Why are you doing all this for me?" Mr. Harrison stopped walking, looking down at the girl who barely reached his waist. How could he explain something he didn't even fully understand himself? "Sometimes, Emily, life puts us in the right place at the right time. I saw you needed help, and I just couldn't ignore it. But you know what? I think you're helping me. Just as much as I'm helping you." Emily frowned, confused. "How can I be helping you? I don't have anything." "You've reminded me that there's more to life than work and money. Sometimes we need someone to show us what's really important." Before Emily could respond, a sudden dizziness made her stagger. Mr. Harrison caught her quickly, noticing how impale she was. "Emily, what's wrong?" "I'm kind of dizzy," she mumbled, her eyes struggling to stay open. Mr. Harrison scooped her up in his arms without hesitation, feeling how feverish she was. Dr. Ramirez had warned about this. Emily's body was very weak, and any exertion could be too much. "We're going home now. You need to rest." On the way to his mansion, Mr. Harrison made a few quick calls, arranging everything for Emily's arrival. When they finally arrived, Susan, the housekeeper, was already waiting for them at the door. Emily, still in Mr. Harrison's arms, could barely keep her eyes open, but she still tried to look at everything around her. The house was enormous, bigger than any place she had ever been. "Susan, please draw her a lukewarm bath and then help her change. I'm going to call the doctor to come examine her." The housekeeper, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, approached with a gentle smile. "Come on, honey, we're going to take care of you." But when Susan tried to take her in her arms, Emily clung tightly to Mr. Harrison's shirt, the fear evident in her eyes. "No, don't leave me," she whispered, starting to tremble. "It's okay, Emily. Susan will take very good care of you, and I'll be here when you're done with your bath. I promise." Emily looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of a lie. Finding only sincerity, she slowly loosened her grip on his shirt. Susan gently led her upstairs, talking softly about how she was going to love the room they had prepared. Mr. Harrison stood in the entryway, watching them climb the stairs, his heart heavy with a mixture of worry and something else. Something he couldn't name. His phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. It was his assistant, reminding him of the important board meeting that was happening at that moment. "Cancel it," he said simply. "Cancel all appointments for today. I have something more important to do." Hanging up the phone, Mr. Harrison went upstairs towards the guest room. He could hear Susan's soft voice talking to Emily and the sound of water filling the bathtub. Suddenly, a sharp scream cut through the silence of the house. Mr. Harrison rushed to the bathroom, his heart pounding. "What happened?" Mr. Harrison burst into the bathroom, finding Emily huddled in a corner, trembling violently. Susan was kneeling next to her, trying to calm her down, but without success. The bathwater continued to run, creating a warm mist that further blurred the girl's precarious vision. The water is too hot," Emily sobbed, hugging her knees. "Like last time?" Mr. Harrison approached slowly, realizing that there was more to that reaction than just fear of hot water. Emily was having some kind of flashback, reliving some traumatic memory. "Emily," he called softly, kneeling at a safe distance. "You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you. Can you tell me what happened last time?" The girl continued to tremble, but her breathing began to calm down a little as she heard the familiar voice. After a few moments of tense silence, she began to speak in a voice so low that they could barely hear. "After Mom disappeared, I was very dirty. A lady said she would help me, let me take a bath at her house." Emily paused, her small hands tightening on her knees. But the water was scalding. She said street kids needed very hot water to clean all the dirt off. It hurt so much. Mr. Harrison felt a surge of anger so intense that he had to take several deep breaths to control himself. Susan had tears in her eyes, a hand covering her mouth in shock. "Emily," he called again, his voice controlled despite the fury he felt. "May I come closer?" When she nodded slightly, he moved slowly until he was beside her, taking care not to make sudden movements. "Look," he said, reaching out towards the bathtub. "I'm going to put my hand in the water. If it's too hot, I'll be the first to feel it, okay?" Emily watched, still trembling, as Mr. Harrison tested the temperature of the water. Susan quickly added more cold water until it was lukewarm. "See, it's nice and cool now. Do you want to feel?" Emily extended a hesitant hand, touching the water with her fingertips. Her eyes widened in surprise as she felt the pleasant temperature. "Susan's going to help you with your bath, and I'll be right outside, okay? If you need anything, just call." Slowly, Emily began to calm down. Susan, with infinite patience and gentleness, helped her undress and get into the tub. When the lukewarm water touched her battered body, Emily couldn't help but sigh with relief. As Susan carefully washed her tangled hair, they discovered several small scars on her back and arms, silent marks of the months spent on the streets. Each one told a story of survival that a 6-year-old should never have lived. Outside, the bathroom, Mr. Harrison paced back and forth, his phone pressed against his ear. He spoke in a low but firm voice with his private investigator. "I want you to find everything about her mother's disappearance, and I also want to know about any reports of child abuse against street kids in the area where I found her. Specifically, look for someone who might have hurt a child with hot water." After the bath, dressed in soft, new pajamas, Emily looked like a different child. Her hair, now clean and detangled, revealed itself to be a golden brown that shone under the light. But her body was exhausted, and she could barely keep her eyes open. Susan led her to the room they had prepared. A spacious room with walls in soft shades of blue and a bed too big for her small body. Emily looked around, trying to absorb every detail with her limited vision. Is this all for me?" she asked in an incredulous whisper. "Yes, honey," Susan replied with a gentle smile. "This is your room now." Emily sat on the edge of the bed, her hands stroking the soft blanket as if it were the most precious object in the world. Then something caught her attention. A new teddy bear was propped up against the pillows. Can I take it?" she asked timidly. "Of course you can. It's yours too." Carefully, as if fearing that the bear might disappear at any moment, Emily picked it up in her arms. It was soft and smelled new, so different from everything she had known in recent months. Mr. Harrison watched from the door, his heart clenching as he saw how something as simple as a teddy bear could mean so much to her. When Emily finally Lay down, clutching the bear. Her eyes were already heavy with sleep. "Rest for a little while," he said softly. "Later, we'll bring you something to eat." But before he could leave the room, Emily's sleepy voice stopped him. "Will you be here when I wake up?" The question, so simple and yet so full of meaning, made something inside him break. "Yes, Emily, you can sleep soundly." As the girl finally drifted off to sleep, Mr. Harrison remained at the door of the room, watching her gentle breathing. Susan approached silently. "Sir, the doctor has just arrived." Dr. Miller, a respected general practitioner who had been caring for the Harrison family for years, examined Emily while she slept. His face grew more serious with each discovery. "Besides the severe malnutrition, she has several vitamin deficiencies," he explained later in Mr. Harrison's office. "I found signs of poorly healed injuries, probably from falls or assaults. She's also anemic, and her immune system is severely compromised." Mr. Harrison listened to everything with a somber expression. "What can we do? I'll prescribe a series of vitamins and supplements. Food needs to be reintroduced gradually. Her stomach isn't used to regular food. I also recommend that she be seen by a child psychologist. The trauma she's suffered isn't just physical." As the doctor wrote the prescriptions, a sharp sound cut through the silence of the house. Emily was screaming again. Mr. Harrison rushed to her room, finding her sitting up in bed, eyes wide with panic. "Mommy, Mommy," she cried, still caught in some nightmare. "Emily, it's okay, you're safe." Mr. Harrison tried to calm her, sitting on the edge of the bed. The girl blinked a few times, tears streaming down her face as reality slowly returned. When she finally recognized Mr. Harrison, she threw herself into his arms, sobbing. I dreamed she was calling me, but I couldn't reach her." Mr. Harrison hugged her, feeling her small body tremble. "Shh. It's going to be all right. We're going to find her, Emily, I promise." Dr. Miller, who was watching from the door, gestured for Mr. Harrison to come over. Reluctantly, he tried to pull away, but Emily clung to him tighter. "Don't go. Please." "Emily," Susan called from the door. "How about some hot chocolate? You must be hungry." The mention of chocolate made Emily hesitate. It had been so long since she had something like that. "I'll be right back," Mr. Harrison promised. "I just need to talk to the doctor for a minute." Emily looked between him and Susan, clearly torn. Finally, she nodded slowly and let Susan lead her to the kitchen. In the hallway, Dr. Miller looked concerned. "Mr. Harrison, I need to be frank with you. Her emotional state is very delicate. This fixation on her mother. How long has she been missing?" "According to Emily, a few months." "Why?" The doctor hesitated. "Mr. Harrison, you need to prepare yourself and prepare Emily for the possibility that her mother—" "No," Mr. Harrison interrupted him sharply. "We're not going to assume the worst. Not yet. That little girl has already lost too much." Before the doctor could respond, they heard a crash coming from the kitchen, followed by Susan's scream. When they got there, they found Emily collapsed, on the floor, convulsing violently. "Good heavens," Dr. Miller whispered, rushing to her side. "We need to get her to the hospital now." Mr. Harrison scooped Emily up in his arms, her small body shaking uncontrollably. As he ran to the car, a single question hammered in his mind. Had he waited too long to help her? The white lights of the hospital hallway blurred as the doctors rushed the gurney where Emily lay. Her small body still had occasional spasms, and her breathing was irregular. Mr. Harrison ran alongside, holding her small hand, refusing to let go until a nurse stopped him from continuing. "Sir, you need to stay here. Let the team work." He stopped, feeling completely helpless as he watched Emily disappear through the double doors of the emergency room. Dr. Miller had called the hospital during the ride, and a team was already waiting for them. The doctor's words still echoed in his mind. Hypovolemic shocks, severe dehydration, possible multiple organ failure. Susan arrived a few minutes later, carrying a bag with some clean clothes for Emily and the teddy bear she had liked so much. She found Mr. Harrison sitting in one of the chairs in the waiting room, his head in his hands. "Any news?" she asked softly. He just shook his head negatively. His hands were still trembling, and his expensive shirt was stained with the hot chocolate Emily had spilled when she fainted. The next few hours were torture. Doctors and nurses went in and out of the emergency room, but no one stopped to give information. Mr. Harrison paced back and forth, occasionally stopping in front of the double doors, as if he could see through them by the strength of his will alone. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a doctor came out to speak with them. His face was serious, and Mr. Harrison felt his heart skip a beat. "Mr. Harrison, I'm Dr. Jones, head of the emergency team. We were able to stabilize Emily, but the situation is serious. What exactly happened to her?" The doctor consulted the clipboard in his hands. Emily suffered a collapse caused by several factors. Prolonged malnutrition, combined with severe dehydration and an untreated infection, pushed her body to its limit. Her kidneys are compromised, and her liver shows signs of insufficiency. Mr. Harrison needed to lean against the wall to keep from falling. How had he not realized that she was so sick? "But she's going to be all right, isn't she?" His voice came out more desperate than he intended. "We're doing everything we can. The next 48 hours will be crucial. We've started treatment with broad spectrum antibiotics, and she's receiving intravenous hydration. We've also started parenteral nutrition to avoid overloading her digestive system." "Can I see her?" The doctor hesitated. "She's in the pediatric ICU. We don't normally allow visitors at this time, but..." He looked at Susan, who was still holding the teddy bear. "It might be good for her to have something familiar nearby when she wakes up. 5 minutes only." Mr. Harrison followed the nurse through the silent hallways of the ICU. The smell of disinfectant was stronger here, and the sound of the heart monitors created an irregular and distressing symphony. When they arrived at Emily's bed, he almost didn't recognize the girl connected to so many tubes and machines. She looked even smaller and more fragile, her pale skin almost blending in with the white hospital sheets. A breathing tube covered part of her face, and several wires ran from her small arms. "My God," he whispered, feeling the tears he'd been holding back finally escape. The nurse gently placed the teddy bear next to Emily. "Talk to her. Patience in induced comas can hear." Mr. Harrison approached, taking care not to touch any of the equipment. He held Emily's small hand, so tiny between his fingers. "Hey, sweetie," he began, his voice choked. "I know you must be very scared right now, but you need to be strong, okay? There's so much I still want to show you. So many places to see." A louder beep from one of the monitors made him stop, startled, but the nurse assured him that everything was normal. "I brought your teddy bear," he continued. "He's going to stay here with you until you get better. And I'm not going anywhere either, I promise." The 5 minutes passed too quickly, and soon the nurse was indicating that they needed to leave. Mr. Harrison reluctantly let go of Emily's hand. "I'll be back soon, sweetie. Be strong." Back in the waiting room, he found Susan talking to a social worker from the hospital. His heart sank. He knew this moment would come. "Mr. Harrison," the social worker introduced herself, "I'm Maria Silva. We need to talk about Emily's legal situation." Mr. Harrison nodded, following her to a small meeting room. The woman opened a file on the table. "I understand that you found Emily on the streets and brought her to your home, is that correct?" "Yes, she needed urgent help." "Your action was commendable, but you must understand that there are legal procedures to be followed. A minor in a state of neglect needs to be referred to Child Protective Services." "No," Mr. Harrison interrupted. Emily can't go to a shelter now. She needs specialized treatment. She needs the eye surgery." Mr. Harrison, the social worker maintained her professional but gentle tone. I understand your concern, but you don't have any legal connection to Emily. You can't make medical decisions for her. Then who will? He stood up, frustrated. Who will ensure that she receives the treatment she needs? That she doesn't lose her sight completely? There are procedures. Procedures? Mr. Harrison laughed without humor. While those procedures are happening, Emily could go blind, or worse. The social worker sighed, closing the file. There is an alternative. You could file for temporary guardianship. Given her state of health and your ability to provide the necessary care, we could expedite the process. Mr. Harrison stopped pacing, considering the proposal. Temporary guardianship. The idea had never crossed his mind until that moment. What do I need to do? First, we need to locate her mother, or at least document attempts to locate her. We'll also need a social assessment of your home, personal references. I'll do whatever it takes, he said with determination. Just tell me where to start. At that moment, a commotion in the hallway caught their attention. Doctors and nurses were running towards the ICU. "Code blue in the pediatric ICU!" someone shouted. Mr. Harrison felt his blood run cold. Code blue, cardiac arrest. He ran down the hallway, ignoring the social workers and the nurses' calls for him to stop. When he reached the ICU, he saw the medical team around Emily's bed, performing resuscitation maneuvers. No pulse. Starting compressions. Charge to 100. Clear. Emily's small body jerked with the shock of the defibrillator. The heart monitor continued to show a flat line. Increased to 150. Clear. Another shock. Nothing. Come on, Emily, Mr. Harrison whispered, his hands pressed against the glass of the ICU. Don't give up, please, don't give up. The seconds dragged on like hours. Every beep of the monitor, every order shouted by the doctors, every movement of the team seemed to happen in slow motion. Last try at 200. Clear! Emily's body arched, with the stronger shock. For a moment only silence, then beep, 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 beep. We have a pulse, announced one of the doctors. Still weak, but it's coming back. Mr. Harrison felt his legs give way, and he slid down the wall to the floor. Emily was alive, for now. Dr. Jones came out to speak with him a few minutes later. That was close, said the doctor, running a hand over his tired face. Her heart stopped for almost 2 minutes. We need to adjust the treatment, increase the dose of some medications. But she's strong, Mr. Harrison. She's fighting. Doctor, Mr. Harrison stood up with difficulty. I need you to tell me the truth. What are her real chances? The doctor hesitated, choosing his words carefully. If she survives the next 24 hours, the chances improve considerably. But even then, the road to recovery will be long and difficult. That night, Mr. Harrison refused to leave the hospital. He sat in an uncomfortable chair in the hallway of the ICU, as close as they would allow him to be to Emily. Susan had gone home to get some things he would need to spend the night, and the social worker promised to return the next day with the papers to start the temporary guardianship process. Sometime during the early hours, while watching the silent movement of the nurses through the glass, Mr. Harrison realized something. In less than 24 hours, that little girl had become the most important thing in his life. The thought of losing her was simply unbearable. His phone vibrated. It was his private investigator. Mr. Harrison, I found something about Emily's mother. You need to see this. The investigator arrived at the hospital 40 minutes later, carrying a thick folder of documents. He found Mr. Harrison in the same place, his red eyes fixed on the window of the ICU, where Emily continued to fight for her life. What did you find? Mr. Harrison asked, his voice hoarse with fatigue. The mother's name is Clara Santos. The investigator began opening the folder. She worked as a cleaning lady in several homes in the area. From what I've been able to gather, she was a hard-working woman, always looking for extra work to give Emily a better life. Mr. Harrison nodded, imagining the kind of life the two must have had, difficult but dignified. And what happened to her? The investigator hesitated, his face taking on a grave expression. That's where the story gets complicated. Clara disappeared. Exactly 3 months and 12 days ago. The last time she was seen, she was going to a job interview at a house in the upscale neighborhood of the city. Which house? That's the problem. No one knows exactly. Clara had mentioned to a neighbor that it was a very good opportunity, a permanent job with benefits, but she didn't give specific details. She just said she needed to go see it in person. Mr. Harrison frowned. And she took Emily with her. That day? No. According to the neighbors, she left Emily waiting at a nearby bus stop, saying she would be right back. It was the last time the girl saw her mother. Mr. Harrison's heart clenched as he imagined Emily waiting hour after hour for her mother who never returned. Didn't anyone look for her? Didn't anyone do anything? A neighbor did file a police report, but the investigator shuffled through some papers. The police didn't give it much importance. You know how it is. Just another poor woman. Disappearing. They probably thought she had abandoned her daughter voluntarily. But you don't think that, do you? Mr. Harrison noticed something in the investigator's tone. No. I found something strange. In the 6 months before her disappearance, Clara had made several complaints. She said she was being followed, that she was receiving strange calls. She even changed her phone number twice. Were the complaints investigated? Superficially. Without concrete evidence, they were filed as paranoia. Mr. Harrison stood up, beginning to pace the hallway. His mind worked quickly, connecting the dots. So we have a single woman raising a young daughter who starts being stalked, receives a mysterious job offer and disappears without a trace. There's more, said the investigator, taking out another document. I found records of other women who disappeared in a similar way in the same area. All with a similar profile, single mothers, working as cleaning ladies or housekeepers. My God, Mr. Harrison whispered, you think that... An alarm in the ICU interrupted him. The doctors were running again to Emily's bed. Mr. Harrison ran to the window, his heart pounding. Emily was having a violent seizure, her small body thrashing against the restraints. The monitors beeped frantically as the medical team tried to stabilize her. Temperature rising, 104 degrees and climbing. We need to cool her down now. Note, 40 degrees Celsius is approximately 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Mr. Harrison watched helplessly as the doctors covered Emily with ice packs, injected medications, and fought to control the fever that consumed her weakened body. After what seemed like an eternity, the seizures subsided and the monitors returned to show more stable signs. Dr. Jones came out to speak with Mr. Harrison. The infection is spreading faster than the antibiotics can fight, he explained. We need to try a more aggressive combination of medications. Do whatever it takes, Mr. Harrison replied. Money is no object. The doctor hesitated. Mr. Harrison, I need to be honest. The type of antibiotic we need to use is very strong. It could further overload her kidneys and liver, which are already compromised. It's a risk. What's the alternative? Without the more aggressive treatment, the infection will continue to spread, and in her current state. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Mr. Harrison understood. It was a risk they needed to take. Start the treatment, he said, and Dr. She needs to hold on for a few more hours. I think we're close to finding out what happened to her mother. As the doctors prepared the new treatment, Mr. Harrison turned his attention to the investigator. What else did you find? Well, I started investigating the other missing women. They all received similar job offers before they disappeared, and they all left children behind. Were you able to track down those children? The investigator shook his head sadly. Most ended up in the system, in shelters or with distant relatives. Some simply disappeared too, like Emily almost did. Mr. Harrison felt a chill if he hadn't found Emily that day. "There's one more thing," continued the investigator. "I found a pattern in the areas where the women disappeared. They were all last seen in the same upscale neighborhood." "Which neighborhood?" "Imperial Gardens." Mr. Harrison froze. He knew that neighborhood well. It was where some of the city's most influential families lived. "I need you to investigate every house in that neighborhood," he said, "especially the ones that hired housekeepers in recent months. And I want to know everything about the residents. Any suspicious history, any rumors." "Gee, I've already started that survey," the investigator interrupted, "and I found something interesting about one of the houses. It's an old mansion, belongs to a traditional family. In the last 2 years, they've hired 6 different housekeepers. All disappeared after a few weeks of work." "Which family?" The investigator was about to answer when they were interrupted by shouts coming from the ICU. It was Emily. She was awake and seemed to be in a panic, trying to pull out the tubes and wires. "Mommy! Mommy!" Her cries were muffled by the oxygen mask, but the anguish in her voice was clear. Mr. Harrison ran to the ICU, ignoring the protests of the medical team. Emily continued to thrash, her eyes wide with fear, fixed on something that only she could see. "Emily, Emily, it's me!" he called, gently holding her hands to prevent her from pulling out the IV. For a moment she continued in a panic. Then slowly, her eyes focused on his face. Recognition brought tears to her eyes. "My Mr. Harrison." Her voice was just a hoarse whisper. "I'm here, sweetie. It's okay. You're in the hospital." Emily blinked, confused, looking around. The panic began to subside, but the tears continued to fall. "I saw her," she whispered. "My mom. She was calling me." "It was a dream, Emily. The fever is making you have nightmares." But Emily shook her head weakly. "No, it wasn't a dream. She needs help. She's trapped." Before Mr. Harrison could respond, Emily's eyes began to close again, exhaustion winning her struggle to stay awake. "Don't leave her alone," she murmured before falling asleep. "Please help her." Dr. Jones took the opportunity to examine Emily while she slept. Her vital signs were slightly more stable, but the fever was still concerning. "She shouldn't have woken up yet," he commented, frowning. "The induced coma." "Is that bad?" asked Mr. Harrison, worried. "Not necessarily. It shows she's stronger than we thought, but we need to keep her sedated so her body has a chance to recover." Mr. Harrison nodded, gently stroking Emily's hair. "She said she saw her mother, that she's trapped somewhere." The doctor adjusted. "The medication drip. Febrile delirium. It's common in cases like this." "What if it's not?" Mr. Harrison turned to the investigator, who was watching from the door. "What if she's trying to tell us something?" The investigator consulted his notes. "Well, there is a possibility. The mansion I mentioned, where the housekeepers disappeared, it has an old basement which was recently renovated. No one knows exactly what for. I need the address of that house, now." "Mr. Harrison," the investigator seemed hesitant. "These are powerful people. If they're really involved in the disappearance of these women—" "I don't care who they are," Mr. Harrison interrupted him. "I promised Emily that I would find her mother, and that's what I'm going to do." He looked once more at Emily, sleeping restlessly in the hospital bed. Her face was still flushed with fever, and the tubes and wires made her look even smaller and more fragile. "Hold on tight, sweetie," he whispered. "I'm going to bring your mother back." But when the investigator finally revealed the name of the owners of the suspected mansion, Mr. Harrison felt his blood run cold. It was a family he knew very well, perhaps too well. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Absolutely. The mansion belongs to the Harrison family. His family." Mr. Harrison staggered to the nearest chair, feeling as if all the air had been sucked from his lungs. The investigator's words echoed in his mind like a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. "It can't be," he murmured. "My parents' mansion has been closed since they died. No one has lived there for years." The investigator consulted his notes. "Officially, yes. Well, I started investigating the other missing women. They all received similar job offers before they disappeared, and they all left children behind. Were you able to track down those children?" The investigator shook his head sadly. "Most ended up in the system, in shelters or with distant relatives. Some simply disappeared too, like Emily almost did." Mr. Harrison felt a chill. If he hadn't found Emily that day. "There's one more thing," continued the investigator. "I found a pattern in the areas where the women disappeared. They were all last seen in the same upscale neighborhood." "Which neighborhood?" "Imperial Gardens." Mr. Harrison froze. He knew that neighborhood well. It was where some of the city's most influential families lived. "I need you to investigate every house in that neighborhood," he said, "especially the ones that hired housekeepers in recent months. And I want to know everything about the residents. Any suspicious history, any rumors?" "I've already started that survey," the investigator interrupted. "And I found something interesting about one of the houses. It's an old mansion, belongs to a traditional family. In the last 2 years, they've hired 6 different housekeepers. All disappeared after a few weeks of work." "Which family?" The investigator was about to answer when they were interrupted by shouts coming from the ICU. It was Emily. She was restless again, her rapid breathing making the monitors beep in alarm. "The fever is rising again," informed a nurse, rushing to check the vital signs. Dr. Jones was called urgently. After examining Emily, his face was more serious than ever. "The new antibiotic isn't working as we hoped," he explained. "The infection is spreading to other organs if we can't control it in the next few hours." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Mr. Harrison understood the gravity of the situation. "How much time does she have?" "It's difficult to say, but at the current rate, maybe 24 hours at most." Mr. Harrison looked at Emily through the glass. Her little face was contorted in pain even during sleep, and her breathing was increasingly difficult. "I need you to keep her alive," he said, his voice filled with determination. "Do whatever it takes. Use the best medications. Call in specialists, no matter the cost." "Mr. Harrison," the doctor hesitated, "it's not a matter of money. Her body is very weak. Even with the best possible treatment, she will survive." Mr. Harrison interrupted him. "She has to survive. I promised her I would find her mother, and Emily has never broken her promise to me. I won't break mine with her." At that moment, Susan arrived running down the hallway, her face pale with worry. "Sir, something terrible happened." "What is it, Susan?" "Your house, someone broke in. It's all turned upside down, and they left this." She held out a crumpled piece of paper. It was a note, written with letters cut out of magazines. "Abandon the search, or the girl is next." Mr. Harrison crumpled the paper tightly. "They know," he said to the investigator. "They know we're close." "Mr. Harrison," the investigator seemed nervous. "I need to warn you. Your uncle, he has powerful connections. If he's really involved in this—" "I don't care who he knows or what power he has," Mr. Harrison replied, his voice trembling with contained anger. "He's keeping innocent women captive. Emily's mother, all of them. We need to get them out of there." "And how do you plan to do that?" "We don't have concrete evidence. We can't just break into the mansion." Mr. Harrison was silent for a moment, his gaze returning to Emily. The girl had begun to tremble, even covered by several blankets. "We have one advantage," he said finally. "Victor doesn't know that I've discovered it's him. He doesn't know that the mansion has been identified." "What are you planning to do?" "I'm going to confront him face to face." "That's insane," exclaimed Susan. "He's dangerous, sir. If he finds out you know." That's exactly why I need to act now, Mr. Harrison interrupted her. The longer we wait, the longer those women are suffering. And Emily, he looked again at the ICU. She's dying. She needs her mother. The investigator scratched his head, worried. Even if you manage to get into the mansion, how are you going to find them? The house is huge, and if they're really in the basement... I know that house better than anyone, Mr. Harrison replied. I grew up there. I know every corner, every secret passage, including... He paused, remembering something. There's an entrance to the basement from the back garden. It was my hiding place as a child. Victor never knew about it. At that moment, a sharp sound cut through the conversation. Another alarm in the ICU. Emily was having another seizure, more violent than the previous ones. Temperature 106 degrees. Pressure dropping. We need more ice. Temperature adapted to Fahrenheit for consistency. Original measurement would have been approximately 41 degrees Celsius. Mr. Harrison watched helplessly as the medical team struggled to stabilize Emily again. Every second that passed was one less second in the battle for her life. I can't wait any longer, he said, grabbing his coat. I'm going there now. Sir, please, pleaded Susan. At least wait until dawn. It's even more dangerous in the dark. Mr. Harrison shook his head. We don't have time. Emily doesn't have time. Before leaving, he went once more into the ICU. He approached Emily's bed, now calmer after receiving more sedatives. I'm going to bring your mother back, sweetie, he whispered, kissing her hot forehead. You just need to hold on a little longer. Promise you'll fight. As if she had heard, Emily moved her head slightly, a small moan escaping her parched lips. Mr. Harrison, called Dr. Jones from the door, if you really intend to do this, you need to be quick. Her condition is worsening with each hour. Mr. Harrison nodded, memorizing every detail of Emily's face. He didn't know if he would see her again, but he needed to try. Susan, stay with her. Don't leave here for a minute. If anything happens to me, promise you'll take care of her. The housekeeper had tears in her eyes. You're coming back. You have to come back. On the way to the parking lot, the investigator caught up with him. I can't let you go alone, he said. It's too dangerous. No. If something goes wrong, someone needs to know the truth. You need to tell the authorities. But besides, Mr. Harrison continued, I need you to do something more important. While I'm at the mansion, I want you to find out everything you can about my uncle's business dealings. Bank accounts, properties, anything that can help us prove what he's done. Already in the car, Mr. Harrison looked one last time at the ICU window. The sky was beginning to darken, foreshadowing a moonless night, perfect for what he needed to do. He started the engine and sped towards the Harrison mansion. In the passenger seat, Clara's photo seemed to stare at him, her gentle eyes so similar to Emily's. I'm going to get you out of there, he promised aloud. I'm going to bring you back to your daughter. What Mr. Harrison didn't know was that his uncle wasn't alone in the mansion that night, and that someone was already waiting for him. The Harrison mansion loomed against the night sky like a shadow of the past. Mr. Harrison parked his car 2 blocks away and approached on foot, his steps silent on the deserted street. Every detail of the house brought back memories, some good, from childhood with his parents, others disturbing, involving his Uncle Victor. The back gate still had the same old lock. With his hands trembling slightly, Mr. Harrison used the key he had kept all these years, a small piece of metal that he carried with him as a last reminder of his mother. The garden, once so well tended, was partially overgrown. Plants grew uncontrollably, creating distorted shadows under the dim light. Mr. Harrison moved carefully among them, following a path that his feet seemed to remember instinctively. The secret entrance to the basement was behind an old decorative fountain, As a child, Mr. Harrison discovered that some stones in the base were false, hiding a narrow passage. His father had it built as an escape route during more turbulent times, but it ended up becoming the secret hiding place of a lonely boy. As he approached the fountain, a movement in the second-floor window caught his attention. For a moment, he was sure he had seen a face watching him, but when he looked again, there was no one. Carefully, he removed the false stones. The passage was still there, although narrower than he remembered. Taking a deep breath, he turned on the flashlight on his cell phone and began to descend. The tunnel was damp and claustrophobic, with spider webs brushing his face as he advanced. After a few yards, he reached a small metal door. Through it, he could hear muffled sounds coming from the basement. Voices. Someone was talking inside. "We can't keep them here for much longer," said a male voice that Mr. Harrison didn't recognize. "The police are starting to ask questions." "The police aren't going to do anything," replied another voice. This one Mr. Harrison recognized. "Immediately, Victor. I have everything under control. The problem now is my dear nephew." "What are you going to do with him?" Harrison was always too curious for his own good, just like his father, and we know how that ended for my brother, don't we? Mr. Harrison felt his blood run cold. The death of his parents in a car accident had always seemed suspicious, but he never had proof. "What about the girl in the hospital?" asked the first voice. "If she dies, it will draw even more attention." "Little Emily won't last long," replied Victor with a cold laugh. "I made sure of that. The on-call doctor received specific instructions on which medications to administer." Mr. Harrison needed to cover his own mouth to keep from screaming. His uncle had bought someone at the hospital, was actively trying to kill Emily. He grabbed his cell phone, his hands trembling so much that he could barely type. He needed to warn Susan, have them stop any medication. No signal. Cursing under his breath, he pocketed his phone. He needed to hurry. Every minute lost was a minute less in Emily's life. Carefully, he pushed the metal door open. It creaked, slightly, revealing a dimly lit corridor. The voices were coming from a room to the right, but it was a different sound that caught his attention. A muffled sob coming from the opposite direction. Following the sound, Mr. Harrison reached a darker area of the basement. The smell of mildew was stronger here, mixed with something else. Something sickly. His flashlight revealed a series of metal doors, all with small, barred windows. Makeshift cells. The sobbing was coming from the third door. Mr. Harrison approached silently and looked through the bars. His heart almost stopped. Sitting on the dirty floor, hugging her knees, was a woman. Her hair was disheveled and dirty, her clothes torn, but Mr. Harrison recognized her immediately from the photo. It was Clara, Emily's mother. "Clara?" he called in a whisper. The woman lifted her head, startled, her eyes wide with fear. Who's there?" "My name is Harrison. I'm here to help. Your daughter, Emily." "Emily?" Clara stood up, staggering. "You know my daughter? Is she all right? Please tell me she's all right." Mr. Harrison hesitated. "How do you tell a mother that her daughter is dying in a hospital?" "She needs you, Clara. She needs you very much right now." Clara began to cry harder. "I tried to get back to her. I tried so hard, but they don't let anyone out of here. Some tried and..." She shuddered, leaving the sentence unfinished. Mr. Harrison examined the lock on the door. It was old, like everything else in the house. Maybe. He pulled out the keyring he had brought from his pocket. In addition to the garden key, there were others he had found in his father's office years ago. The third key he tried fit perfectly. The moment the door opened, Clara practically fell into his arms, sobbing. "Calm down," he whispered, holding her. "We still need to get the others out." What a touching scene. Mr. Harrison froze. He knew that voice. Slowly, he turned around. Victor was standing at the end of the corridor, a cruel smile on his face. Beside him, a tall, strong man was pointing a gun directly at them. My dear nephew, Victor continued, his voice dripping with false cordiality. Always trying to be the hero, aren't you? Just like your father. Why? Asked Mr. Harrison, instinctively placing himself in front of Clara. Why are you doing this? Victor laughed. Why? Money, of course. You have no idea how much rich people pay for well-trained housekeepers. Housekeepers who can't just leave, who don't have family to miss them. You're sick. No, my dear nephew. I'm a businessman. Something you never really understood. Always too worried about morals, about doing the right thing. He made a face of disgust, just like your father, and look where that got him. You killed my parents? Victor's smile widened. The brakes on their car simply failed. Accidents happen all the time, don't they? Like what's going to happen to you tonight. He gestured to the man with the gun. Last chance, Victor, said Mr. Harrison, his mind working frantically to find a way out. Let them go. All of them. Or what? Victor laughed. Are you going to report me? To whom? The police work for me. The politicians work for me. You have no idea the reach I have. The power I've built up over all these years. He approached, his eyes gleaming with a maniacal light. You know what's most ironic? That little brat in the hospital. She would have just been another missing street kid. But you had to play the hero, didn't you? Had to meddle where you weren't wanted. Mr. Harrison felt his blood boil. If anything happens to Emily... Oh, but it already is, interrupted Victor with a cruel smile. At this very moment, she should be receiving a special dose of medication. A final dose, let's say. Clara let out an anguished cry behind Mr. Harrison. No, she screamed, trying to advance on Victor. The man with the gun took a step forward. Calm down, honey, said Victor. Soon you'll be joining your daughter. Isn't that what you wanted? To be with her? It was then that the lights in the basement flickered once, twice, 3 times. Victor looked up, frowning. What the? A deafening crash shook the mansion. The floor trembled and dust began to fall from the ceiling. What the hell is going on? Another crash, louder. This time the lights went out completely. In the total darkness that followed, Mr. Harrison acted on instinct. He grabbed Clara and pulled her back inside the cell, throwing himself to the ground with her. The sound of gunshots echoed through the basement, followed by screams and more explosions. What's happening? Whispered Clara, trembling in his arms. Mr. Harrison smiled in the dark. I called in reinforcements. At the hospital, Susan paced nervously down the hallway of the ICU. Something about the new on-call doctor's behavior bothered her. He had arrived just minutes ago, replacing Dr. Jones unexpectedly, and immediately began preparing medication for Emily. It's just a stronger antibiotic, he explained when Susan questioned him. Dr. Jones's orders. But Susan had worked in hospitals before becoming a housekeeper. She knew the routine, the procedures. And something about this situation didn't seem right. Can I see the prescription, she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. The doctor hesitated for a fraction of a second. It's in the system. Now, if you'll excuse me. He tried to pass her towards Emily's bed, but Susan stood firm in the doorway. I'm sorry, doctor, but without a written prescription, I can't allow you to administer any medication. The doctor's face changed. The mask of professionalism gave way to something more sinister. Get out of the way, lady. Don't meddle where you're not wanted. It was at that moment that Susan's cell. Phone vibrated. It was a message from the investigator. Do not let anyone give Emily medication. Doctor has been bought. Susan straightened her shoulders. Years of faithful service to the Harrison family giving her strength. Call Dr. Jones, she said firmly. Now. He's not available. Then I'm calling the police. The doctor took a threatening step towards her, the syringe raised like a weapon. Last chance. Get out of the way or what, Dr. Martinez? Dr. Jones' strong voice echoed down the hallway. He was accompanied by 2 hospital security guards and a nurse. "I thought your shift didn't start until tomorrow," continued Dr. Jones, his tone calm but firm. "And I don't recall prescribing any new medication." The fake doctor looked around, searching for an escape route, but the security guards were already approaching. "Arrest him," ordered Dr. Jones, "and call the police. We have an attempted homicide to report." As the security guards subdued the imposter, Dr. Jones examined the syringe he was carrying. "Morphine," he said, his face paling. "A dose high enough to stop an adult's heart, in a child Emily's size." Susan felt her legs weaken. If it weren't for the investigator's warning. "How is she?" she asked, looking at Emily through the glass. "Stable within the realm of possibility. The fever is down a bit, but she's still critical. The next few hours will be decisive." At the Harrison mansion, the darkness of the basement was pierced only by beams of light from flashlights and occasional flashes from the explosions that continued on the upper floors. "What reinforcements are those?" whispered Clara, still huddled with Mr. Harrison inside the dark cell. "Let's just say my investigator has some interesting friends," he replied, "and I didn't come entirely unprepared." Before leaving the car, Mr. Harrison had activated a device, a gift from his investigator. In 15 minutes, if it wasn't deactivated, a series of small, controlled explosions would be detonated in strategic points of the mansion, causing more noise and confusion than actual damage. "Harrison!" Victor's voice thundered through the basement. "You think your little bombs are going to stop me? How many lives are you willing to sacrifice today?" As if to emphasize his threat, a female scream cut through the darkness, coming from one of the other cells. "The other women," whispered Clara, grabbing Mr. Harrison's arm. "We need to help them." Mr. Harrison knew it was a trap. Victor wanted to make him leave the protection of the cell, but he couldn't abandon the other prisoners. "Stay here," he whispered to Clara. "When I distract them, run to the exit I showed. There's a car waiting 2 blocks away." "No!" Clara held his arm tightly. "I'm not leaving you here. Not after everything you've done for Emily." The mention of Emily brought a new wave of urgency. If what Victor said was true, she was in mortal danger at that very moment. As if reading his thoughts, Victor shouted again, "Thinking about little Emily, nephew? I wonder if she has already received that special dose. How long can such a fragile little body hold out?" Mr. Harrison felt a wave of hatred so intense that he could barely breathe. His uncle wasn't just keeping women captive, he was actively trying to kill an innocent child. Another crash shook the mansion, stronger than the previous ones. The sound of breaking glass and cracking wood indicated that the structure was beginning to give way. "We need to get out of here," said Mr. Harrison. "The building won't hold much longer." But the others. As if answering her concern, different voices began to sound through the basement, male voices firm and organized. "Federal agents, freeze!" Beams of flashlights sliced through the darkness. Sounds of struggle echoed down the corridor. "No!" "Nice try," replied a deep voice. "But it turns out that corruption and human trafficking are federal crimes." Mr. Harrison smiled in the dark. His investigator had done his part. While searching for evidence about Victor's business dealings, he found connections to an international human trafficking ring, the kind of crime that attracted federal attention. The lights began to flicker back on, revealing the chaotic scene. Heavily armed agents were subduing Victor's henchmen. Victor himself was cornered against a wall, his arrogance replaced by pure panic. "This is a misunderstanding," he stammered. "I can explain." "Save the explanations for the judge," the agent cut him off. Then, turning to the cell corridor, "Rescue team, move in. We have hostages to evacuate." Paramedics and rescue specialists began opening the cells one by one. Women in varying states of trauma and malnutrition were being carried out, some needing support to walk, others completely catatonic. Clara watched the scene with tears in her eyes. How many more did he hurt? "It's over," said Mr. Harrison, holding her shoulders gently. "He's never going to hurt anyone again." At that moment, his cell phone vibrated. Finally, there was a signal. The screen showed several missed calls from Susan. His heart froze. "Emily!" The hospital was in an uproar when Mr. Harrison and Clara arrived. Federal officers had already taken over security of the area, and the fake doctor was handcuffed, awaiting transfer. Susan ran to meet them in the hallway. "Thank God you're here. Emily, how is she?" asked Mr. Harrison and Clara at the same time. Susan hesitated. "It's best if you speak with Dr. Jones." They found the doctor at the door of the ICU, his face showing the weariness of hours of vigil. "We managed to stop them from giving her the morphine," he explained, "but her condition has worsened in the last hour. The infection has reached her heart." Clara let out an anguished sob. "She's been asking for you," continued the doctor, looking at Clara. "Even sedated, she keeps calling for her mother." Can I see her?" Dr. Jones nodded. "Come, I'll help you get ready. You need to wear sterilized clothing." As Clara followed the doctor, Mr. Harrison remained in the hallway, watching through the glass. Emily looked even smaller and more fragile than before, her pale face almost the same color as the sheets. Susan touched his arm gently. "You need to rest too," she said. "You've been through so much today." Mr. Harrison shook his head. "Not until she's out of danger." At that moment, something happened inside the ICU. The monitors began to beep frantically. "No," whispered Mr. Harrison, his heart almost stopping. "No, please, not now." Clara, already dressed in the sterilized gown, ran to her daughter's bed. "Emily, honey, Mommy's here. Please don't give up now." But the monitors continued to show increasingly alarming signs. The medical team ran from one side to the other, trying to stabilize the girl. Pressure dropping. Saturation at 70% and falling. "She's going into shock." Mr. Harrison watched helplessly, his hands pressed against the glass. After everything they had been through, after finally having rescued Clara, "Please, Emily," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "You promised you would fight. You promised you would hold on." The sharp, continuous sound of the heart monitor cut through the air like a knife. Emily had stopped breathing. The continuous sound of the heart monitor echoed through the ICU like a cry of despair. Clara grabbed Emily's small, cold hand, tears streaming down her face. "No, my daughter, please, no." The medical team moved with urgency around the bed, initiating resuscitation procedures. Dr. Jones commanded the process with a firm voice, but his hands trembled slightly as he prepared the defibrillator. "Charge to 100, he ordered. "Clear!" Emily's small body jerked with the shock, but the monitor continued to show the flat, unyielding line. "Increase to 150. Clara, you need to step back." "No." Clara refused to let go of her daughter's hand. "Emily, Mommy's here now. I came to get you, my love. Please don't go." On the other side of the glass, Mr. Harrison felt as if his own heart had stopped. Susan hugged him, crying silently as he watched the scene with paralyzing horror. "One more time," shouted Dr. Jones. 200. Emily's body arched again with the stronger shock. For a moment only silence. Then a faint beep, almost imperceptible. Then another and another. "We have a pulse," announced a nurse. "Weak, but it's coming back," Clara sobbed with relief, kissing the small hand she was still holding. "That's it, my love. Fight. Mommy's here." The next few hours were a roller coaster of emotions. For every small improvement in Emily's vital signs, a new complication arose. Her temperature, fluctuated dangerously, and the doctors fought to keep the infection under control. Clara didn't leave her daughter's side for a moment. Even exhausted and still recovering from her own trauma, she refused to rest. She sang softly to Emily, told her stories, begged her to keep fighting. Mr. Harrison alternated between the hallway of the ICU and constant calls with the authorities. Victor's arrest had triggered a much larger operation than he imagined. Dozens of people involved in the human trafficking scheme were being arrested, including influential politicians and businessmen. On the morning of the third day, something changed. Emily's fever began to subside gradually, and her breathing became stronger. Dr. Jones, after examining the new tests, allowed himself a small smile. "The infection is finally yielding," he explained. "The new antibiotic is working. If it continues like this, we can start reducing the sedation in the next few hours." Clara, who hadn't smiled since being rescued from the basement, felt her lips curve slightly. "She's going to be all right?" "Her heart is very strong," the doctor replied. "Stronger than we thought possible for such a small child." In the early afternoon, they began to reduce the sedatives. The medical team warned that the process would be gradual. It could take Emily hours or even days to wake up completely. But Emily, as always, surprised everyone. Shortly after sunset, her fingers began to twitch slightly. Her eyelids fluttered and a small moan escaped her lips. "Emily?" Clara called softly. "Honey?" Slowly, with visible effort, Emily opened her eyes. She blinked a few times, confused by the bright lights and the tubes and wires around her. Then her gaze met Clara's face. For a moment, they just looked at each other. The girl seemed not to believe what she was seeing, as if she feared she was dreaming. Mommy?" Her voice was just a hoarse whisper. "Yes, my love," Clara began to cry. "It's me. I'm here." Emily tried to raise her hand, her movements still weak and uncoordinated. Clara helped her, guiding the small fingers to her face. "It's true," murmured Emily, touching her mother's face, as if she wanted to make sure she was real. "You came back. Forgive me, my daughter," sobbed Clara. "Forgive me for leaving you alone." "I knew it," Emily smiled weakly. "I knew." "You hadn't abandoned me." Mr. Harrison watched the scene through the glass, silent tears streaming down his face. Susan held his arm, also moved. "Are you going in to talk to her, sir?" He shook his head. "Not now. This moment is theirs." But Emily saw him anyway. Her eyes, still sensitive to the light, focused on him through the glass. "Mr. Harrison," she called, her voice still weak. "Come here." He hesitated, looking at Clara, who nodded with a smile through tears. After putting on the sterilized gown, Mr. Harrison approached the bed cautiously. "Hey, sweetie," he said, his voice choked. "You gave us quite a scare." Emily extended her free hand to him. The other was still holding Clara's hand tightly, as if she feared she might disappear again. "You brought her back," said Emily, "like you promised." Mr. Harrison held her small hand gently. "You kept your promise too. You kept fighting." "I was so scared," confessed Emily. "But I heard you calling me, both of you." The following weeks were of gradual recovery. Each day Emily grew stronger. Her eyes, once opaque with illness and malnutrition, began to shine again. The ophthalmological treatment had to be postponed until she was completely recovered from the infection. But the doctors were optimistic. With the proper surgery and time to heal, there was a good chance of recovering much of her vision. Clara also recovered little by little. The scars of captivity were deep, but with psychological help and the unconditional love of her daughter, she began to smile more, to regain the trust that Victor had tried to destroy. Mr. Harrison provided a comfortable apartment for the two, not far from his house. He insisted on paying for Emily's full treatment and ensuring that Clara had time to recover before thinking about working again. "I can't accept all this," protested Clara. "You've already done so much for us." "I haven't done anything beyond what anyone should do," he replied. "Besides, Emily and you gave me something I never had, a family." On a sunny afternoon, about 2 months after waking up, Emily was finally discharged from the hospital. Dr. Jones made a point of accompanying her to the exit, where a small, welcoming committee awaited. Clara, Mr. Harrison, Susan, and even some nurses who had become attached to the little patient. "Ready to go home?" asked Clara, holding her daughter's hand. Emily smiled, looking at all those people who had become so important in her life. Her gaze lingered on Mr. Harrison. "Can I ask for one thing before?" "Of course, sweetie. Anything you want." "Remember that garden you talked about? The one with the sunflowers?" Mr. Harrison smiled, remembering the promise he had made so long ago. "Do you want to see it now?" Emily nodded enthusiastically. Clara looked at the two, curious. "What garden is this?" "A surprise," replied Mr. Harrison with a mysterious smile. "For both of you." The car traveled through the city streets until it reached a quiet neighborhood in the outskirts. When they stopped in front of a large wooden gate, Emily could barely contain her excitement. "Close your eyes," asked Mr. Harrison, helping her out of the car. "You too, Clara." Mother and daughter, hand in hand and eyes closed, were guided along a stone path. The sweet aroma of flowers filled the air, and they could hear the soft sound of running water. "You can open them," said Mr. Harrison finally. Emily opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the sunlight. Her vision, not yet fully recovered, took a moment to adjust. Then, "Oh!" she exclaimed, amazed. They were in a huge garden, all surrounded by golden sunflowers that moved gently with the breeze. In the center, an old fountain murmured its crystalline music, and small paths wound between flower beds filled with colorful blooms. It's more beautiful than I imagined," whispered Emily, turning slowly to absorb every detail. Clara was also enchanted. "What place is this?" "It was my mother's garden," replied Mr. Harrison with a gentle smile. "It had been abandoned for years, but I had it restored while Emily was in the hospital. I thought you both deserved a special place, a place just for you." Emily ran to him and hugged him tightly. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest, "for everything." Clara joined the hug, tears of gratitude in her eyes. For a long moment, they stood like that, united under the afternoon sun, surrounded by the gold of the sunflowers. Later, as he watched Emily and Clara exploring the garden together, Mr. Harrison realized something important. Sometimes families aren't formed only by blood. They are formed by love, by choices, by moments of courage and compassion. Emily stopped running among the sunflowers and waved to him. "Come see," she called, her smile brighter than all the flowers in the garden. "There's a bird's nest here." Mr. Harrison smiled and went to join them. There in that reborn garden, among the sunflowers that always followed the sun, a new family flourished. Not in the way any of them could have imagined, but exactly in the way it was meant to be. And the sunflowers, eternal silent observers, continued their golden dance under the blue sky, forever guarding the secrets and smiles of that new beginning.